You've been here for 34 weeks, they told you 8. Your water ration this morning was half a liter, just under a pint, for the whole day. You drank it before 0900 hours and spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about the fact that there wasn't any more. The temperature hit 49 degrees Celsius, just over 120 Fahrenheit before noon. The flies came with the heat, not a few, not an annoyance, clouds of them, thick enough to blacken your food before you could get it to your mouth. And somewhere beyond the wire, close enough that you can hear the engines on a quiet night, is Erwin Rommel, the man who just drove the British back 800 kilometers, nearly 500 miles, in 6 weeks. The man who broke every defensive line he'd touched since France. The man who looked at your perimeter on a map and told his staff this would take 48 hours. It has been 238 days. You are not a Special Forces soldier. You're 20 years old. You're a shearer from Queensland or a factory worker from Sydney who enlisted because there was a war on, and that's what you did. You had never seen a Panzer before. You saw one coming through the wire at you. You have no way out. The road behind you is in Axis hands. The only thing connecting you to its outside world is a Royal Navy destroyer that comes in at night. If it makes it, sprints to the dock, unloads under blackout, and has to be gone before dawn, or the Stukas find it in the harbor. Sometimes it doesn't come. Your commanding officer's standing order is 4 sentences long. Every man in every forward post knows it by heart. There will be no Dunkirk here. If we have to get out, we'll fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat. Rommel called you a rat. You wrote it on your helmet. This is the Siege of Tobruk, 241 days, and you're about to find out what it actually cost and what it broke on the other side of the wire. That's what it felt like to be inside the perimeter. Now let me tell you why the man standing beyond that wire, for all his reputation, could not break what those men built. By April 1941, Rommel had done something genuinely unprecedented. In 6 weeks, his Afrika Korps reversed 6 months of British gains. The retreat was so fast that officers in Cairo were burning documents before Rommel's reconnaissance units even arrived. But here's what the mythology around Rommel consistently skips. His formula had a weakness built into it from the beginning. Speed worked because it created chaos. The moment the enemy stopped running and started thinking, speed became a liability. Fast armies eat fuel fast, they burn ammunition fast, they wear out equipment fast. Rommel's supply line already stretched 300 kilometers back to Tripoli. 800 miles of coastal road the RAF could hit at will. Every day he spent stalled in front of Tobruk was a day that weakness compounded into crisis. He needed that port. He needed it fast. What he didn't know was what was waiting inside it. The 9th Australian Division, 4 infantry brigades, understrength, most fresh from garrison duty in Palestine. Average age around 20. Farmers, factory workers, mechanics. Men who had never seen a Panzer before Tobruk showed them one through the wire. And Major General Leslie Morshead, the man who set the tone for everything that followed with 4 sentences and no qualifications. No Dunkirk, no surrender, no retreat. Here's the question I want you to sit with before we get into the fighting. Rommel had momentum, armor, air superiority, and a formula that had worked everywhere he'd tried it. The garrison had a crumbling perimeter, half rations, obsolete tanks, and a 48-kilometer line 30 miles, of Italian bunkers designed for a force 3 times their size. On paper, this wasn't a fight, it was a countdown. So why didn't the countdown run out? April 13th, 1941. Rommel commits. 60 Panzers. Motorized infantry from the 5th Light Division. Stukas providing cover. A textbook combined arms push against the western perimeter. The same formula that had collapsed the British line 3 weeks earlier. Here's what his intelligence hadn't accounted for. Morshead had reversed the Italian bunkers. Positions built facing inward, toward the city, had been turned outward to face the desert. Anti-tank ditches were redug. Minefields relayed at angles that didn't appear on any German approach map. The anti-tank guns positioned not to cover obvious routes, but to create overlapping fire from the flanks. Drive straight at the perimeter and you didn't face fire from the front. You faced fire from everywhere. The Panzers crossed the outer wire and hit the minefield. 3 tanks immobilized in the first 60 seconds, because those mines weren't where German reconnaissance said they'd be. The remaining armor veered left, looking for a gap, and found Australian infantry in slit trenches at 50 meters, barely 55 yards, that shouldn't have existed on any map they carried. By 0600 hours, 17 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled inside the perimeter, The survivors withdrew. For the Australians inside those trenches, that morning was the first moment they understood the perimeter might actually hold. Now here's the consequence that goes far beyond the tank count, because this is what actually changed the campaign. Rommel's operational strategy depended on the enemy breaking psychologically before breaking physically. The formula worked because defenders, faced with armor punching through their line, made a rational decision. If the line is gone, there's no point dying for it. They retreated. The retreat became chaos. The chaos became collapse. Tobruk was the first place that sequence failed from the very first assault, because the Australians didn't retreat when the Panzers came through. They held their posts, called fire onto their own forward positions, and counterattacked at night to retake ground lost during the day. From Rommel's perspective, they behaved like men who had either decided the formula didn't apply to them, or simply didn't care that it existed. That meant every subsequent assault had to start from zero. No accumulated psychological pressure, no sense the garrison was weakening, just the same fire, from the same positions, at the same cost. He tried again April 16th. Same result of 30th, his largest assault of the siege. Elements of 3 divisions, 3 hours of Stuka and artillery bombardment. The Panzers broke through the outer line. For 90 minutes, it looked like the siege was over. Then the Australian 25-pounders opened up on the penetration zone. Danger close. Rounds landing 30 meters, about 33 yards, from friendly positions, because the infantry and gunners had built the kind of trust in 3 weeks that most armies take years to develop, because they had no years, they had days, and no room to be wrong. The German infantry following the tanks into the breach found a labyrinth of trenches and strongpoints that weren't on their maps. They took one bunker. Australians counterattacked through a trench the Germans didn't know existed and took it back. Rommel lost another 17 tanks. He pulled back, and for the first time since France, his after-action report didn't have a plan for the next day. Now I need to tell you what holding actually meant, because the mythology smooths the human price of it into something more bearable than it was. The flies arrived in May, not a few, millions. They covered every surface and bred in the latrines and swarmed every scrap of food before you could get it to your mouth. Men lost 20-30 pounds, 9 to 14 kilograms. Dysentery tore through the garrison in waves the field hospitals. Operating in underground bunkers lit by kerosene lamps couldn't keep pace with. Surgery happened during air raids, because the raids never stopped long enough to wait for. The Stukas came every morning at 0600 hours. You could set your watch by the scream. 4 seconds from the sound to the impact. Enough time to get flat, not always enough to get to cover. The Royal Navy ran supplies in at night on what the sailors called the Spud Run. Destroyers sprinting 280 nautical miles from Alexandria through waters the Luftwaffe patrolled. Make it in, unload fast, gone before dawn. If you were still in the harbor at first light, the Stukas found you. Some ships didn't make it, because without those ships the garrison died. Not dramatically, slowly, calorie by calorie, liter by liter. Inside the perimeter, Morshead refused to let the garrison become passive. Every night, Australian patrols slipped through their own wire and into no man's land. Not to watch, to raid. They hit German supply dumps. They cut telephone lines. They came back with prisoners, not for the satisfaction of it, but for the intelligence. Every prisoner came back with information about patrol schedules, supply routes, unit positions. The garrison built an increasingly detailed picture of Rommel's operations, while his picture of theirs stayed fractured. The men running these raids were not special forces. They were the same 20-year-old infantry battalions holding the perimeter during the day, moving through the desert at 0200 hours in rubber-soled shoes with blackened faces, and the kind of focused accumulated anger that 8 weeks of half-liter water rations generates in a person. A German divisional report captured in June 1941, sitting now in the Australian War Memorial Archive, assessed the garrison as, and I'm quoting directly, unusually aggressive for a besieged force, and recommended that German units avoid patrol contact at night where possible. Read that slowly. The army doing the besieging was avoiding night contact with the people they were besieging. That single line tells you more about how Tobruk actually worked than any battle map. The cost was real. Most of the men who disappeared on patrol vanished into the dark without witnesses. A line in a war diary the next morning was often the only record they'd existed there at all. By the end of the siege, the garrison had taken approximately 3,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. German and Italian losses across the same period were higher. Conservative estimates put Axis casualties at more than double that figure. Behind every number on both sides of that ledger is the same thing. Someone who answered roll call somewhere in 1940 and ended up in a slit trench in Libya running out the clock on a timeline that kept getting extended. Around May, Rommel handed them something he didn't intend to. German propaganda referred to the garrison as rats, trapped, scurrying, creatures living in holes, waiting to die, designed to break them. Within weeks, Rats of Tobruk was written on helmet, scratched into bunker wall, put into letters home. They drew a cartoon rat, simple, unadorned, and made it the unofficial insignia of the garrison. The word that was supposed to diminish them became the thing they called themselves, proudly, without irony. Rommel called them rats. They stopped fearing Rommel somewhere around week 6. And I think that moment matters more than most histories give it credit for. When an enemy tries to humiliate you and you laugh and keep his insult as a trophy, that's not bravado. That's a particular kind of contempt that only develops when you've genuinely stopped being afraid of the person expressing it. The psychological distance between Rommel and the men inside that wire, which should have been running in his favor, had reversed entirely. He was the one outside, spending tanks he couldn't replace against perimeter that wasn't moving. They were the ones naming themselves after his frustration. The name outlasted the siege by decades. After the war, the survivors formed the Rats of Tobruk Association. Membership strict, you had to have served inside the perimeter between April and December 1941. They marched in Australian cities into their 80s and 90s. The last major gathering was 2011. 70 years on, still wearing the badge. Most of them never talked much about the flies or the thirst or the dark, just the fact that they'd held. In August 1941, the decision came from Canberra. Rotate the Australians out. The extraction happened by sea, a few hundred men at a time, on the same destroyers that brought the supplies in, under fire in the dark, over several weeks in August, September, and October. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. Every time I read through the accounts of this siege, several men had to be ordered to board the ships. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 241 days of half-liter water rations, daily bombardment, dysentery, patrol losses in the dark, and when the ship finally came, when the thing they had been waiting for since April was finally in the harbor, some of them didn't want to go. I don't have a clean explanation for that. I'm not sure one exists, but I think it says something about what belonging to something truly does to a person's sense of what they're willing to leave behind. Operation Crusader, launched in November 1941, broke the siege from outside. British forces linked up with the Tobruk garrison on December 10, 1941, 241 days after it began. Now here's the significance of what those days actually accomplished, because this is the part that gets lost when the story becomes legend. Rommel's greatest asset in 1941 was not his tanks, it was momentum. The same momentum that had worked in France, that had collapsed the British line in Cyrenaica, that made every Allied commander feel permanently one step behind. Tobruk stopped that momentum cold. Every week the garrison held was a week Rommel couldn't push into Egypt. Every Panzer destroyed in front of the wire was one less for the drive to Suez. Every supply convoy routing around Tobruk, instead of through it, stretched his logistics thinner. His fuel situation went from difficult to a permanent crisis that shaped every operational decision he made for the rest of 1941. That bought the British time to rebuild the 8th Army. Time for Lend-Lease equipment to arrive. Time to set the conditions for what would eventually become El Alamein. Tobruk didn't win North Africa, but without Tobruk, there may not have been a North Africa to win. Rommel's staff diary, recovered after the war, has one notation next to the April 1941 entries. Next to Tobruk, someone wrote a single word: impossible. The rats held anyway. If you carry this story, a grandfather whose name is on the nominal roll at the Australian War Memorial, a family that kept this quietly for decades, tell me in the comments. I read them. The comments section holds more history than most people realize. If this is the kind of history you care about, the kind that doesn't fit into a paragraph or a battlefield map, subscribe. We document one of these every week. The next video covers what happened when Rommel came back to Tobruk in June 1942. Different garrison, different outcome, A fall so fast it reached Churchill on the floor of the House of Commons. That story doesn't end the way most people think it does. And the man responsible for handing Rommel the victory he'd spent a year trying to earn wasn't German.